So I'm just waiting for folks to come on online. Hopefully any minute now. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So you all are live now, hopefully.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Hi. And so this is Chris and Austin, and they're going to be leading a workshop/talk on mob programming. And I'm going to let you all introduce yourself. And with that, let's get going.
All right. While Chris is bringing up the slides, I'll introduce us a little bit. So my name is Austin Chadwick, and co-presenting and hosting today is Chris Lucian. And we're both mob programmers. And this session here at the conference will be sharing about mob programming and DevOps and how they work really well together. And then following that, we're going to be doing a workshop that's kind of going off of this official conference. But that's already full. But if you're interested, please reach out to us on our Twitter handles, which we'll show here in a minute when we start sharing screens, and maybe we'll do something like it again.
Yeah.
And,
so to our facilitator, I believe our slides are attempting to be shown, but they're not currently on the stream. We're going to get some help with that.
Gotta love remote live, right? Technology.
Thank you so much.
Hey, there we go. Now we're live.
All right.
All right. So I think I already kind of covered the intro, Chris. So you can go ahead and kick it off and get us going on the next slide.
Okay. We'll introduce ourselves more, maybe our history a little bit in a later slide, but we can kind of get right into the action a little bit. So I'll let Austin kind of kick us off here with why experiment?
Sure. So as you see, Chris and I will kind of be having a conversation of slides here. And so the first thing is we'll be explaining what mob programming is, but why experiment with it? From my experience from not doing mob programming and then doing mob programming, I saw a huge jump in the things you see here. Continuous delivery, low work in progress, development joy, clean code, psychological safety. And so many other teams around the world have tried out mob programming and found it's amplified many of these excellent things. And while we can't seriously recommend anything to you, we can share what's worked for us. And for me, that's why I think it's worthwhile experimenting with mob programming with DevOps in particular. Yeah, anything to add to that, Chris?
Yeah, maybe some of these phrases have some explanation that can go along with them. So low work in progress is like a lean concept. So we've seen a lot of the lean stuff happen quite a bit more. Talk a little bit more about that later. Continuous delivery is a big one in the DevOps space. Clean code, bug zero. We've seen the team that Austin and I work on has experienced 1.5 years on a single mob with no bugs reported from production, releasing 2 times a day. We use a lot of concepts like development joy to evaluate the things that we have, and it's been a pretty cool experience for sure. And so,
right on.
So I can talk a little bit about just the technical aspects of it. So you could probably take a screenshot of this, but these are some of the practices that we use. We have a core development process, and put together for this talk, we've put together a little bit of a core DevOps process, just talking about all development's mobbed, all DevOps are mobs. We bring in people from the ops side and things, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But you'll notice here that we have a key focus on quality. And so on the development side, we have automated testing, automated UI tests, a lot of these key refactoring concepts to make things extensible. On the core DevOps process, you'll see a lot of the other things that are available too. Maybe Austin, you can take this one.
Yeah, so as you saw on the last slide, there was a lot of things in there like automated infrastructure as code, automated tests, feature development. And often, if you look at this slide here, traditionally, each of those functions are isolated and siloed and specialized, right? So you have on the left part of the slide, you have developments isolated from ops, and ops is isolated from QA, and QA is isolated from security. And so how do we do all those things for every card, for every feature we're working on for a software system, and get all those things done all the way to production if everyone's distant and not talking to each other, right? And so I think one thing that was great with the DevOps movement is it put people on the same team, but still you can, especially remote maybe, people aren't talking as much. And so people are passing from they'll do one part of a card and then they'll pass it to the next person, then the next person. And so me working that way, I've seen a lot of lag or waste in the system from that way of operating. And so that's what comes to mind to me with these pictures here is it's been difficult to achieve all those awesome things in that last diagram when we're not talking to each other in ways that could make it much more efficient. Do you have anything to add to that one, Chris?
Yeah, so there are fences in between everything there. So when you hear the term "throw it over the fence," we talk a lot about resource efficiency and flow efficiency. So we like this TED talk, and we send it to a lot of people, and it's called the efficiency paradox. And he talks a lot about this idea that you're going to individual resources, and he talks a lot about the healthcare system. And when they're siloed, it might be that they're in entirely different buildings. And for systems that I've seen in the past, ops and dev, completely different building that they're in, let alone walking up and talking to them. And the closer that I've been while doing software development to somebody in an ops side, the more face-to-face collaboration we have. So flow efficiency allows for this idea of basically getting everybody in the same place and getting an item all the way out. So take a look at that.
Yeah, and so lean is about eliminating waste, and value streams map are a great exercise to do. And you can see one we drew here. And it talks about each step it takes to go from an ideation all the way to production to the users, right? And what I've noticed is when a lot of companies and organizations focus on resource efficiency, going back to the previous slide, make everyone very busy in their specialization. But then what it leads to is a lot of wait time in between each piece, right? And so drawing out a value stream map will help make this obvious, right? So specialist A does their development, and then they pass it over the wall, and then there's a wait time to the next thing. And so mapping it all out helps you see where your issues are. And and I'll talk a little about this one. So talking a little about DevOps and mobbing, we want to talk a little about ourselves so you know where we're coming from. So my name's Austin Chadwick, as I said before. I've been a software engineer for about 15 years. And I've worn many, many different hats, from business analyst to developer to tester to scrum master to writing continuous integration and continuous delivery for teams, and that being my little silo. And so I've been able to see it all over the map, all the different roles and different things that happen. And so I'm actually pretty thankful for that broad experience. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, so I'm currently the director of software development at Hunter Industries, and over the years, I've experienced things like no longer estimating, and also mob programming and scaling mob programming, and now remote mob programming, and so a lot of experiences, key experiences, have come to me, and I'm a big believer in continuous improvement, continuous learning, and so. It has a lot to do with that. And so both Austin and I have been mob programming for quite some time. He had a previous company. I'm a co-founder of mob programming on the team that Woody Zool was in, as well as our other teammates at the time. And since then, we've been mobbing all of our DevOps as well. And so maybe Austin, you want to talk a little bit about your history with mobbing?
Sure. I mean, the one thing I'll say is, I went from not mobbing to mobbing, and then the first day of mobbing full time, we pushed a feature all the way to production, and it blew me away. I was freaking out. I was like, "Is this really happening?" So I really saw how mobbing helps those efficiencies happen. And everything we're going to say today is going to sound a lot like advice and prescription, and it's really not. We can't really recommend anything. Software development and people in the Cynefin framework are complicated, complex, chaotic. And so really what we can do is share what's worked well for us and great things we've seen. And then you can, if you're inspired by that, you can take and experiment with that. People are always going to be sharing things, and every context is different, right? And so you can take it, inspect it, adapt it, and keep iterating on it. And there's really no prescription, one size fits all for everything. And we just wanted to make that very clear before we say a bunch of stuff that sounds like you all should be doing this. Yeah, definitely. And and so mobbing has definitely been a big part of that for me. I've become a huge evangelist of it. I can't stop sharing about it. It's just it's been really fun, and the benefits has been so inspiring, and I just love being a part of this community. Yeah.
All right. So another piece of that is that when we share and talk about a lot of these things, I get a lot of feedback that's like, how could our organization ever get to where you are today? And so I think one thing that everybody needs to kind of come away from this is that everything can be iterative, and we'll talk a lot about iteration going forward on DevOps. But I have a saying: no practice envy. So stop worrying about what other people are doing and how far along they are. Just compare yourself to where you were previously, and work on that. And we will, and we're just here to provide, just like Austin's saying, sharing and things along those lines, sharing the difference. So, Austin, you want to talk about the danger of complacency?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about some meta stuff a little bit before we jump into specifically what mobbing is and how it works well with DevOps. And one thing is the danger of complacency. And so as Chris was talking about his story a little bit, it's really, he's really passionate about continuous improvement. And I've seen it in many organizations where it's just always about getting the next thing done. And it's kind of complacent on thinking about your process, inspecting it, and trying to think about how we can get better. And you just start accepting all the pains that are there. And and you just kind of, and for me, I like mobbing with people who bring up issues because it helps me not be complacent.
So the way that you might not be complacent, right, is this idea of the virtuous loop. So we talk a lot about this on the Mob Mentality Show, the podcast that Austin and I run. And this is basically this idea of dedicated learning time and then retrospectives and leading to extreme ownership. And so things that engineers don't typically get in organizations that are just feature factories, for example, is dedicated learning time. And they don't reflect on what's gone well and what's gone poorly. And so the improvement, so that's my definition of complacency. If you're not reflecting and changing and you're not learning, then you're complacent. And so that's just kind of my idea on it. Austin, do you want to talk a little bit about extreme ownership and its relationship to the virtuous loop?
Sure. And that ties right into turn up the good as well, is that if you are reflecting on your process of retrospectives and you have time to learn to make things better, you can turn up the good, right? And this is a concept from Woody Zuhl, where every day you can make an incremental 1% improvement, right? And then over time that can build and build and build. And you just focus on, hey, what went well today and what can we turn up to make it better for tomorrow? And the way that extreme ownership plays in is you really want your teams to own their process and own their workflows, and they can decide and really change how it works, and they can iterate on that and keep turning up the good. And mobbing originally came from people just turning up the good. They were in that virtuous loop we're talking about, and they're, hey, what's working well? Well, it works well when we do these training things together, where we're all together in the same room working on the same computer. And then when they came into an issue with production work, they're like, hey, let's turn up that good again. And someone asked for help, and then they started working on production work that way. And so this kind of meta cultural thing of, hey, let's look for ways to turn up the good, reflect often, and then have dedicated time to learn to figure out how to do things better. And so that's what occurs to me for turn up the good. And if you turn up the good even more, what does that lead to, Chris?
Yeah. So remember those silos and those walls that we were talking about earlier. the idea is that, if we know that flow efficiency is good over resource efficiency, and we know that cube walls separating everybody causes a resource efficiency style environment, what would cause a flow efficiency style environment? And we kind of discovered this through serendipity, but mob programming emerged out of that serendipity, and now it's some of the things that we see and the results are sort of obvious when you talk about the efficiency paradox and you talk about lean. It's the idea that we can get something from inception to production in the shortest amount of time possible. That's different than fully utilizing every one of our resources.
All right. And so turning up the good of having all the different specialists working together, dev and ops and security and test, what does that look like? So what is mob programming? So we're going to get a little bit specific here, at least one way that mob programming is done. It can be done several different ways. But in basic, as Woody says, it's all the brilliant minds working on the same thing at the same time in the same space and on the same computer. So here you see some pictures of some mob programming environments, and this is non-remote mob programming. There's also a remote version of mob programming. But as you can see, everybody's working on the same computer and collaborating on the same card or work item or feature at the same time. And it seems radical, and it seems, how could it possibly work? And so, here's one anti-pattern of how it could not work.
Yeah, what is it? The driver and the watchers? I heard this from a visitor one day, and they were kind of visiting our environment, and it came up that it's like, okay, well, in pair programming, I just watch when the other person's typing, and then they watch me, and so it was like a pair anti-pattern. But then, their next question was around, well, what is so you're having 3 people watch instead of just 1, and so we said, well, back up, like, that's a little bit different in the pair programming world, and even going back to the into the mobbing. And so we have a number of ideas, or just kind of ways to anchor people when we're talking about what people could be doing. And it's definitely not just watching the screen and while somebody else does the work. I especially like the picture here, because I'd probably be that nervous too if everybody was just watching in silence. That'd be very uncomfortable, for example. And so, while Willem Larsen was working with us, he basically had defined a game, and it had been super useful. So I handed it off to Austin.
Yeah, sure. So he saw a lot of mobs working really well together, and he observed all these different roles that people take on while mob programming. And we'll be jumping into each of these roles to kind of give you an idea of what it's like to mob program, and what one example of what good can look like. Again, inspect and adapt if you're trying out mobbing, and you'll probably come up with different roles or better ways to do it. But he, before we jump into each of the roles, so Willem Larsen made a mob programming RPG game, and here's the link on GitHub. And you can play this game, and it's a great way to introduce mob programming, because it forces you to try on each of the different hats while you're working on a feature or on some code or on some DevOps work, and it gives you points as you do each of the roles.
Yeah, and another thing, kind of a key that happened. First started mobbing a long time ago. We had a timer that was telling us to rotate, and it was so loud that when I was getting coffee on the other side of the office, it actually, I heard people saying that H is that, or expletives that you might think of, and so I realized that we were bringing everybody in the office with a super loud timer, because people wouldn't release the keyboard unless we had a real timer. Wrote the first version of the mob timer back then in order to silently get people to transition. Since then, there have been tens, if not hundreds, of others written. This one here is a open source mob timer from Dylan Kearns, and which is quite good. And all these mob timers help everybody switch and go task, which might lead us to Kanban.
Yeah, and so the timer helps you switch who's at the keyboard, whether remotely or in person. So another thing that is a helpful tool while mob programming is Kanban. And so you can kind of see it behind me in the picture back there. It's a whiteboard with cards on it and magnets. And in the course of any work, and especially in mob programming, you have lots of ideas. You have the mobbers, everyone in the mob and their ideas, and they come up as we're working on stuff, or we'll be interacting with the customer and they'll have ideas. And we basically just need a place to help, for me at least, keep myself sane, right? So it's good for me to write down the idea and say, hey, that's an excellent idea. We're not working on it right now because we're in the middle of something else. So let's put it on the wall and to do. And then it just helps keep us focused.
Apparently one of our slides got a little bit messed up here. Whoops, let's go back. So behind the slide, a driver role for the mob programming roles. And in here, we have different patterns. And you can go to the website to see everything that's there. You'll see the driver badge there. Oh, I actually see the racer helmet on the bottom right here. And so what's really interesting about this is the person that might think that they were just being watched, right? The difference, though, is that this person has to be listening to somebody else. So game, typing something you disagree with gets you experience points. Using a new keyboard shortcut, learning something new about the tooling, and ignoring direct instructions who isn't the navigator. These are all kind of positive patterns that the driver follows. And what you don't want to see from a driver is basically writing the code that's in their head and not verbalizing. In our department, we actually have a requirement that all code is verbalized. And this includes infrastructure as code, and this includes security, and every aspect of DevOps actually is said out loud before it becomes automation. And everything that we do repeatedly, we attempt to turn into automation gradually. And so the driver is the one listening to those verbalizations and entering them into the computer. This is a key aspect of this, is that the driver should not move forward if code or instruction hasn't been verbalized. And so there might also be different levels of navigation, and we'll talk about that in different areas, but you interpret whatever's said out loud, and then you ask for higher or lower levels of navigation so that you can optimize the amount of things that you can type in based on your understanding of what was navigated. And that's a really important aspect of all of this. Another piece of it is you'll notice that in the picture on the bottom there, we have multiple keyboards and mice. And so kind of setting up your environment how you like it. Being remote right now, that's not as important as being in person, but you can kind of see how those things work out.
Yeah, and so while doing DevOps work, so the driver is the one taking the ideas from the mob and putting them into the computer. So I can think of examples. When I first started mobbing, we started working on infrastructure as code to deploy things to production, right? And I had little to no idea what I was doing. And so driving was a great way to learn, and navigating also a great way to learn. If you're the expert and you know exactly what to do, hey, we're going to write this script, it's going to do this thing, we're going to put it in our pipeline. You verbalize it and the driver will put it in. But even if you don't know what to do, the navigator can ask the mob, say, hey, I don't know what to do. Can you help guide me here? And then they'll explain it to me as the navigator. And then I'm the funnel of the ideas of the mob into the driver. And I say, okay, driver, here's what we're going to do. Go to line 10 and type this. And it's amazing the rate at which you learn when you take on these roles of things you didn't know before.
Yeah, and kind of to add on to that, the mobber is the next role. And so the game is divided into levels. And so currently just focusing on getting really good at the driver and the navigator is the most important thing. And to be a good mobber in general, without going into the other roles, you have this idea of yielding to the less privileged voice. So this might mean that somebody is a junior developer or brand new, and they have an idea, and a senior developer has an idea, or a senior DevOps engineer has an idea. Who should you listen to? A lot of people would say listen to the senior role, but we kind of do the exact opposite. If the senior can't explain their idea well enough, then the junior role is going to be the one that takes that on. So I'll let you tell this story.
Yeah, and we'll be hitting some more roles, but here's just a story from mob programming with DevOps. Is I was working on a mob where to deploy a mobile app to production took 120 manual steps. We wrote them all down, and you had to click through this. And we knew it was painful. We didn't know what to do about it. But another mob had recently figured out how to automate all of that. And so that ops or DevOps specialist, he was able to join our mob. And then within a matter of a few iterations, we were deploying to production instead of avoiding it like the plague because it took so long. We were deploying to production daily through the App Store. And it's just such a thrilling experience to go from all the manual steps to having it all automated.
And I remember this story, and one thing I witnessed is that this person did research on their own before bringing it to their mob, and then that was brought to everybody else's mob. And so this highlights the researcher role quite a bit because this is the idea that you're 4 people around the computer, or any number of people around the computer, and so when you reach something that is interesting or difficult, it's the idea that any one of those people can open up a laptop on the side and start searching for relevant information in documentation, blogs, websites like Stack Overflow, things along those lines. But the researcher role is extremely important because one piece of flow efficiency is removing roadblocks as fast as possible. Then how about this one?
Yeah, so there's also kind of interpersonal excellence that needs to happen in a mob, and the sponsor is a great role to help that happen, right? Chris was talking about amplifying the unheard voice before, so it's easy if you're not careful, if this role isn't activated, for someone to dominate in the mob. Like they're just trying to navigate all day long, and there's people who aren't contributing, aren't learning, and what happens often is diversity of ideas lead to the best results in my experience. And so asking people to share, or picking the least privileged voice, or, helping boost the mood, so, when we complete a card or we figured out a really difficult problem, to help celebrate that, right. Can really help move the mob along.
And another thing, so when I was first mobbing and I had a lot of technical expertise in an area, I was navigating a lot. And so this is another great advanced role. And when I was navigating a lot, I realized that my voice started to hurt. And we thought about it. I brought it up in a retrospective, and we thought about it a lot. And it was this idea that every person, if you're in a 4-person mob, you probably should have everybody speaking about a quarter of the time. And that's kind of a good loose metric on how the equality of participation. If you can't get that, then the rear admiral or navigating the navigator is a really great way to talk about it. So maybe the rear admiral would quietly talk into the navigator's ear and tell them what to navigate, things along those lines.
Yeah, and so another fun story for me with DevOps mob programming is we had an app, we had it basically working, and we wanted to deploy it, the smallest piece of it possible to production to get our pipeline working and moving. And we were writing the infrastructure as code manually because we didn't know any better way. And DevOps, more specialist, was walking by and heard what we were doing. He's like, can I join your mob for a little bit? Oh, great. He's like, I've been researching this tool during my learning time. And within a matter of an hour, it automated the infrastructure of code through some command line interfaces we did, and we had deployed like 6 resources into the cloud all automatically, and then it generated all the infrastructure as code. And it took one of our mobbers, I think, a day or so to believe it really happened. He kept questioning, like, is this real? Is this real? And it's just the benefit of having someone come mob with us who has the expertise.
Yeah, and somebody walking by like that is the embodiment of the nose. Even is that if you see something that is redundant or could be automated or refactored and you call it out, that's kind of the responsibility of the nose. This is the idea that you might point out long lines of code or complex conditionals, duplication, automation that hasn't happened. So this might be infrastructure as code. This might be security checks. This might be telemetry that has been overlooked. The nose is there to kind of sniff out things that could be added into the stack that would ultimately save time and money going forward. And that story is a really great example of that.
Yeah, and one difficult part about teams, whether you're mob programming or not, is understanding each other. And so it's easy to have a circular conversation where, like, I'm saying A, and then the other person says B, and then we just keep repeating ourselves, A, B, and it's hard to just talk it through. And so the archivist is the role in the mob who gets up on the whiteboard and starts drawing. And so we had this recently when we were trying to handle security in the cloud and write the correct infrastructure as code to set it up appropriately. And the archivists, many of them stood up and started drawing their ideas, and we laid out different options with different diagrams. And then we started to make progress in our conversation. Like, oh, that's what you mean. And it's much easier to talk to a picture than it is to just hearing each other verbally or texting each other in a Slack-like system. And so that's a great role that really helps a ton in resolving issues.
This one's a relatively recent addition to the game, and that's the traffic cop. And I thought about this when when I saw that it's like, oh, hey, we've kind of slipped on doing Kanban or something along those lines. And it's like, oh, well, reminding the team about Kanban right now would be a really good idea. And so this eventually explicitly became the traffic cop, which is, point out when the team voices a process or working agreement, suggest relevant new processes or working agreements, articulate the current task at hand and make it visible to the entire mob, capturing design decisions and other technical details for the team. This is the idea that you want to keep everybody kind of on track to maintain that flow.
And this one we've been hitting on a lot all throughout because it's really part and parcel with DevOps type work is the automationist. And I think it's one of the cornerstones of at least my experience in mob programming is for me, automating things is not my first thought. So for me, I'm more like, hey, let's keep the code clean. Let's, maybe more of a sponsor, maybe more facilitator. But in every mob I've been on, there's always been an automationist who's focused on, hey, Austin, you seem fine doing that redundant task and over again. But, we can automate that and then you never have to do it again and we can move on to more valuable work. And I've seen this again with boilerplate code, with things I didn't know could be automated as far as in the pipeline and continuous delivery. And it's just been a phenomenal experience mobbing with these type people.
Recently we had Zach Rogers on the show, and we talked about DevOps mobbing and mobbing with DevOps and learning. And so maybe Austin, you can talk a little bit about this one too.
Yeah, so I got to mob with Zach, and he was new to software development and new to continuous delivery and all these things. And so he joined our mob, and it was just really fun to see his journey because he really latched on to DevOps type concepts. And he went from, just being a driver and learning how to do it and starting to navigate in our mob to now where he's more of a DevOps champion in our organization. And he's just, sharing about it, learning about it all the time, hosting little workshops on it. And it's just fun to see mobbing help that grow.
Nice. So kind of moving back into a little bit into the meta space, mobs for me have, this was another visitor had talked about the steamroller effect. And this is the idea that nothing gets in a mob's way. I've seen when working alone that there will be times where myself or my teammates would just get stuck for long periods of time. And we would always see that like, oh, why is it still taking that long? And it would be weeks before they asked for help because there was a disincentive to ask for help. One, they were worried that they wouldn't get their stuff done, and two, the people that they were asking for help also were worrying the same thing. And so it was a really big deal if somebody went and helped you. In a mob, you have multiple brains there to do those things, and nothing gets in.
All right, so it looks like we lost Chris, but I'll keep rolling here. Hopefully he'll come back online and bring the slides. Let me pull him up to my left so I can at least start hitting some of the points. So the next one was kindness, consideration, and respect. So as you would think, you get everyone mobbing together, everyone in the same space, whether it's remotely or in person. And interpersonal issues will probably start to occur. And so a cornerstone of mobbing and working together well is kindness, consideration, respect. And this came out of one of the original mob programming teams, is they said, hey, what things do we value and what things do we want to turn up the good? And kindness, consideration, respect were those top three things. And it's really a ladder that helps you build on to the next great things. And that also includes psychological safety. And so, so Chris is pulling up the slide here on psychological safety. And what psychological safety is, and there's a great book, many great books on it, but it's the idea to articulate, raise an issue or say what you're thinking and be your real true self and not hold back and bring your full ideas to the mob. And look, all right, great. We got the slides back up. And did you want to add anything on psychological safety, Chris? Oh, he's also working on his audio. So, so we recently did a book group on psychological safety. It's called The Fearless Organization. Excellent book. I highly recommend it. It talks about ways to build towards psychological safety, and one is being vulnerable about what you don't know, and so that'll inspire others to also be vulnerable about what they don't know. And you start by assuming psychological safety and start by sharing your ideas. So the next slide is that you can't see is the Satir change model, and the Satir change model is it's basically a way to think about how teams handle change. And you'll see this happen a lot in mob programming, probably in a much more amplified way than when teams are working differently in cubicles or more isolated. And you have your status quo of the way things are working. Someone new joins the team or a new idea comes in. And so there's this time where the team kind of goes through chaos. And it's totally natural. It's going to happen with teams. And then you have a transforming idea, and then you're able to integrate and then kind of establish your new status quo at a higher performing rate. And the thing is you can't avoid the Satir change model from happening, but what you can do is get really good at going through this. So we're going to be doing a workshop later today where people are going to be mob programming with people they've never have before. And so when this occurs, it's good to know about this model to say, hey, yes, we're going to go through chaos. With mobbing, it's going to be a little more amplified, but we're going to get good at figuring out how to get out of it and reach our new status quo. And the next slide after that, while Chris is trying to bring that back online, is transparency, metrics, and consistency. And so another kind of meta thing is, how do you measure mobs and teams working in this way? And just sharing from experience, I've seen a lot of anti-patterns with metrics. But it is good to be transparent to the other organizations or your customers or whoever you're working with. And instead of measuring the internals of the system, you try to measure the outcomes. And while it's much harder to measure the outcomes, one thing that's worked really well for us is measuring. Yes, you're back. All right, it's good to have you back.
Sorry, everybody. That was really odd. I don't know what happened, but let's keep it up.
Yes, so you can skip Satir change, and why don't you talk about this one, Chris, a little bit more?
All right, sounds good. Sorry about that, everybody. So transparency, metrics, and consistency. So this is another thing where, just being in the leadership role, I have to explain mob programming and the efficiencies a lot. One thing that we use as key performance indicators, is this idea of essentially using release frequency and zero bugs. And then, bugs being kind of anything that surprises a human or something along those lines. And so keeping bug counts low or at zero, and then also basically showing metrics around release frequency. This stuff is much more important, in my opinion, than, say, velocity or anything along those lines. And so just kind of outcome driven. I know DevOps talks a lot about that. And so it's pretty interesting. And maybe Austin can talk a little bit about my slide from Japan here.
Yeah, so diffusion of innovation is a great concept that has to do with how innovative ideas start and how they kind of move through the system, right? And it's a good concept to have in mind because change doesn't happen overnight. There's often stages of innovators, early adopters, and then you got to cross this big chasm, and early majority, late majority. And I've seen this happen really well with DevOps, and mobbing, I think, really helps amplify the change. But it's also good model to keep in mind, because as you're thinking about, like, hey, it'd be great if we had automation and my current team or mob is not open to it. You're looking to find your early adopters or innovators who are willing to try it out and pour into those people and give them the space and time they need to grow the skills. And then once the early majority sees it working well for those people, then it has a chance to cross the chasm. So it's just a great organizational change tool to keep in mind when you're trying to bring DevOps concepts to your teams. And I've found it to work really well with mobbing. And
nice to see that the practice of mobbing crossed the Pacific and not only the chasm. So,
oh, that's why you had. Yes,
yeah.
Mob programming is all around the world, done in Europe, Japan, and many other places. And so it's been fun to see it grow. But it started just in a few places with some early adopters and innovators. And so upcoming next will be learning, right? Yes. So you want to talk about that one, Chris?
Yeah, learning as a competitive advantage. So this is the idea. Richard Sheridan has a book, Joy Inc., and he talks a lot about this concept. But any team, a lot of the time, it's in the technology world especially, it's how quickly can you pivot. And what's nice about this picture here actually is that this was a kind of dedicated DevOps team that was formed for a while. That was DevOps, security, and development there with their core interests. And so that was a pretty cool picture when I found it. But learning as a competitive advantage is basically, how quickly can you learn something to then automate those 120 steps like we talked about in that story before. This idea that if we never sat down to learn that technology, we'd still be doing those 120 steps every time we released. How likely would it have been that we would have been doing daily releases if we had to do 120 steps that we had to remember every time we released? And so it's really important to keep in mind that there's definitely a need for essentially continuous learning and overcoming those things, especially to strike flow efficiency for a team. The main roadblocks is going to be everything that the team doesn't know yet. And so the speed at which you do development is going to be directly tied to how quickly you can remove known and unknown unknowns for the development process. And this includes DevOps as well. And so it's really important to consider learning and having dedicated learning time and things along those lines to keep that competitive advantage alive and well.
Yeah, and one thing I learned about that is great to have learning time for is technical debt. And I'm sure we've all experienced it. And one thing that really jumps out to me with technical debt DevOps is something called the Scout Rule. It comes from Bob Martin book, Clean Code is at least one place it comes from, but it also applies to DevOps. And the idea is you always leave the campground nicer than when you found it, or the code or the pipeline, right? And so, yeah, I'm sure in any of your processes, and I know in mine, there's all these things we want to make better, right? And so every time we're doing something manual, instead of like, stop everything, we're not going to develop any more features until we clean up all our technical debt, you can scout it, right? And you can say, okay, it's 120 manual steps. Let's eliminate the first 5 and automate those, and then we'll finish on completing our card, right? And so you can chip away at that technical debt.
And another thing that is really important about mobbing and just mobbing rules is like people criticize mobbing sometimes, saying like, okay, well, what if somebody's bored or on their phone or something along those lines? We maintain this idea of the law of personal mobility. Or the law of 2 feet from the open spaces. And if you haven't been to an open space conference, I highly recommend going, and there should be hopefully a lot of online ones starting up soon. But this idea that if you're not contributing and you're not learning, then you should go to a different mob. And even recently, when a team was kind of moving too fast or something along those lines, somebody basically said, hey, I'm going to go because I'm not learning and I'm not contributing. And it was a good retrospective point to say, well, wait a minute, why are you not learning and not contributing? And we actually talked about it, and they ended up not leaving, but it was a really eye-opening moment. It's because we have that rule that let us do that.
Yeah, and often emergency is a catalyst for good changes. There's been several times in my life where bad things have happened, and it's motivated me to try something different, and mobbing was part of that. And so some of my first experiences were coming out of bad experiences, and that led to full-time mobbing. and leading to great changes. Chris, do you have any things to add?
Yeah, I mean, so all through my life as well, this has been the case. So when I started doing no estimates, that's when the military had an emergency and we couldn't estimate, we just had to deliver. When I started doing mobbing, we had an emergency and we needed to be able to release something quickly and get past hurdles, and we did that. When we started scaling the team, there was an emergency and we had to start scaling the team because of that emergency. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but even COVID-19 is changing a lot for us, and we'll talk about those changes and how you can turn those things positive later.
Yeah, and please continue on this one as well, Chris.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. This slide. So there is a talk basically about being okay with failure and comparing two pottery classes. One pottery class that is told that the best pot at the end of the semester is going to be the one that we use, and the other one was just told that they're going to weigh their work over the course of the semester. That picture was from my dad, who also does pottery, and he has beautiful work, but it's because he made hundreds of thousands of pots, not just tried to make the perfect one. So check that out.
Yeah, and one thing is about the virtuous loop is having retrospectives, and it's not only turning up the good, but also bad things, right? So we would keep our, we'd run retrospectives multiple times throughout the day, small ones, and we look through like, hey, here are things we said we were going to try or do. How are those going? Should we stop trying this? This is not working for us. And so to check in using those retrospectives and in your mobs or in your teams and saying, hey, what things are we doing that we should stop doing? And so basically for any experiment you run, you want to be able to see when it fails so you can stop.
Yep. And so one thing that might lead into is estimation really providing value to you. I talk about this a lot in general in other locations, but and you can go and see a blog of mine called The Software Estimation Paradox. But if we are paying people to automate things, and you basically can only estimate well things that you have done many times before, then DevOps engineers and software engineers, we would be paying them having them estimate, we'd be paying them to get good at estimating or incentivizing in some way. Therefore, why would we pay somebody to basically be doing something and not automating it? And so because automation is part of our world every day, estimation is diametrically opposed to that.
Yeah, and now that your blood pressure is higher about hearing no estimates, one thing that helps teams and mobs try out new things are things called lofty goals. And so these are things we aspire to, and we will do lean coffees and retrospectives on these ideas. And in relation to DevOps, one of them is no one between us and production, right? And so with any mob, you have at least 2 pairs of eyes on the code. And that means you have live QA, live code review, and we should be able to go all the way to production as often and as frequently as we can. And, to be honest, our teams have always been there, but it's great to have the lofty goals to retrospect on and say, hey, how can we get there? How can we be delivering frequently? And
that quote, I think, came from Yahoo, which is no one between code and production. And we adopted that, and it's been very useful for us. I'm going to go back to the idea of emergencies leading to change, just because we have this relevant topic right now. It's this idea of basically, COVID-19 is around, and we were basically, had no remote at all. And then we were kicked to being all remote. And so you'll notice from the screens here, we have mobbers, we have code, we have the Kanban, we have our different setups here. And so yet again, another emergency has led us to remote mob programming and the concepts there. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about that transition.
Yeah, and I haven't done remote work. Well, actually, I have done some remote work without mob programming. And I've also been doing full-time. So we transitioned from full-time in-person mob programming to full-time remote mob programming. And it's been fascinating to feel the experience and then talk with others who aren't having that. And so with full-time remote mob programming, it's been incredible. I mean, the interaction and the fun and the productivity has stayed through remote. We just have the video chat on all day. And it really helps with the isolation problem. And other people I've talked to who have had to switch to full remote, it's been emotionally a struggle. And I really like the quote from remotemobprogramming.org, and it's that with remote mob programming, you're home, but you're never alone.
Yep. And I'll just tack onto that you can see our environment here in the past, and everybody's in person at large screens, and so this would be like politically incorrect to organize like this today, right? And so what's interesting is that since going remote, I've been talking to people all day, every day. I've been joining remote mobs. I have an abundance of social interaction during my work day. And it's very so going from this to remote has actually been a fairly light transition, where I think that it's a little bit different for the people that are experiencing this for the first time.
Yeah, and one aspect to switching to remote is commute time. So we've seen it before that many have loved the mob programming environment, but to all get together in the same building, some people have to commute quite a ways because their roots are in farther away places from the particular building. And so one great thing about remote is a lot of those pains went away, but yet people were still able to get together and remote mob program. And so this kind of, leads to maybe the sponsorship role in mob programming or kind of development joy, is that when you're working with people all day together, you're being kind, considerate, respectful, you can start having fun, So I think Alex here is wearing my Christmas gift to him. And so.
Yeah, another efficiency that we saw, it's kind of been a weird thing, and is that in the past, we've realized that our product owner relationships directly depended on how and often we saw them. And so when going to remote, I was expecting to see a reduction in efficiency because our product owners basically didn't, I was worried that less interaction because we're remote would be harder on us. But what was interesting is that the product owners a lot of times were in other buildings. And so we saw the exact opposite effect. Once we removed the actual barrier of walking from their desk to ours, we saw them a lot more. And so we actually observed many new efficiencies around this, which has been a really strong thing.
Yeah, and so just to rapid fire, share some tools that we've helped if you want to experiment with DevOps, remote mob programming. One kind of in relation to the product owners is having Trello or Microsoft Teams, planner board, which is basically a virtual Kanban board, and share that with your product owner. For me, I've seen AnyDesk work really well, Teams video chat, and those are some of the tools that occur to me. How about you, Chris?
Yeah, so I really like just anything like AnyDesk, so like TeamViewer as well, basically multiple people controlling the same machine. I'll just talk about the physical setup a little bit, which was really cool, is that we have all of our mobbing stations, which are pretty beefy computers, and they're kind of on site, and we're remoting into them. And so everybody being remote to that one machine has been a really good thing. Slack-like systems. Microsoft Teams has a cool feature as well of the basically being able to jump into channels that have video chats, and so it's like walking around the office. It has very little to do. Mind mapping tools, drawing tools are also really great communication systems. So I think we're pretty close to the time where we'd answer Q&A. So if you have questions, start queuing them up. But maybe you can outro us, Austin, while we do that.
Yeah, so while you're queuing up your questions, we just want to say thank you. This was a phenomenal opportunity. We love sharing about our experiences with mob programming. If you want to hear more, you can reach out to us on YouTube, Twitter, podcast. And so on Twitter, it's mob__mentality. And we have, over 50 videos on all these many of the topics we've covered today. We interview people from all around the world who are doing mob programming and remote mob programming, and they get to share their experiences and what's working well and what's not working well for them. And you'll see many times in these episodes, we also talk about DevOps and how it relates to mob programming. And with that, I guess I'll kick it over to the host to facilitate the Q&A.
Sure. So we do have a couple minutes and a couple questions. So I'm going to start with the last one. So in practice, how many mobbing hours a day seems to work right now during the lockdowns? How well does it work to just leave the Zoom online all day and try to do mobbing work?
Yeah, so we're using Microsoft Teams for communication, but this works for Zoom as well, the workshop we're going to be doing that with. But we mob for 7 hours a day, and then we have an hour of learning session. And so, this has been the case even before we were remote. So for the last 8 years, I have either been part of mobs or managing mobs that have been mobbing for 7 hours a day. And so Woody Zool was the manager for about the first 4 years, and then I started managing it when he left.
Wow, that's impressive. So I'm sure we can find more resources on your videos in terms of mobbing. Another question was, does everyone have to be at the same level of knowledge to make it work? And I think you kind of referred to it during the presentation, but someone has different levels, seniors, juniors, tech leads on the team. Yeah. How do they make it work?
Yeah, so a lot of it is, I think it's actually the opposite. The best way to do it is to have a gradient of knowledge. So, and we talk a lot about if you're not learning and not contributing, then choose a different mob. And so learning is definitely a good activity, especially for de-siloing and bringing people up to speed. Most of our developers, we don't have any device set up for them when they first join us. So many teams will have like a 2 week to 6 month ramp up time for a developer. A developer in our environment can become productive within the first few hours that they're there. And so what we see a lot of times is our most junior people end up starting and creating unexpected contributions to the code. So the big piece of that is that the senior developers have to table their ego. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is there's a couple of questions, comments from people saying that they've tried it and it was amazing. But also there's one last question about, is it a must-have? Is it better approach to do mob programming instead of pair programming by default? How is it better?
Okay, so I have opinions on this, but like the first thing is that we're just going back to the just sharing slide and maybe our episode on just sharing is this idea that we're giving you ideas for experiments to try in your environment, and it may or may not work for you. Now, my personal opinion is that when we go down smaller from a mob of more people, what I see is that the tasks that we work on are typically more simple. And so an example of this is that once as a mob, we were working on another project that we didn't have any decision-making power on. And the tasks we were working on were so simple, we wanted to automate them, but couldn't. So then we decided to work individually on the project instead of mobbing. And so this pattern is pretty common. If you feel like the tasks are too simple to mob on, it probably means that you should have automated it a long time ago. And so if you find yourself breaking away from mobbing, my suggestion is to ask everyone, could we automate these tasks instead of breaking up as a mob so we never have to do them again?
We have a couple more questions that just came in. So one is, how do you facilitate remote mobbers with different schedules? So for instance, having different time zones?
Yeah, so we're currently all on the same time zone. I've seen, at the height of performance, I'd say like a truly effective mob typically releases every 4 hours or less to production. And so what I typically will end up seeing or suggesting in those cases is if you can find 4 hours of overlap, then you probably can have a good productive mobbing session happen. And and so these are all just experiments I would run. I don't have mobbers in other time zones right now, but if you have 4 hours of overlap, try and capitalize as much as you can on that 4 hours. And then that would allow you to give knowledge transfer to other teams. And so you might have 2 people from one time zone and 2 people from another time zone mob together. And then the 2 people that sign off may then get another 2 people in the other time zone to mob with those 2 people. Now you get this kind of temporal transition of information as you go. And I think that could be really effective for multiple time zone development.
Cool. One last question is mobbing different than swarming?
Yeah, so I would say that the idea of swarming is that you are working on your own stuff for a while, and then you get together in a war room and then swarm. Mobbing, I think, is a fundamentally different concept. You're kind of going in with the agreement that you're going to work like this all day, every day, and only break apart briefly in certain situations. And so swarming is where everybody gets together as the exception, and mobbing is everybody splits apart as the exception.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think we're at time. So thank you for participating, and this has been awesome. So I hope people who are able to join the workshop enjoy the workshop.
Yes, thank you very much. And it was really great seeing you all. We really appreciate you all being here. And please make donations and the like to this event and or the charities that you feel are important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.